The fear of death. We are fascinated by death. We recreate images of death in our art, and we fill ourselves with moving images of violent death over and over again from our television and computer screens. Yet we fear death greatly. We often seek spiritual enlightenment, or maybe we just want to feel better about ourselves and who we are. Yet we are just as often repelled by death, and rightly so. From a biological perspective, from a material perspective, we shudder when our bodies are threatened. We contract. We push away from death, and we want to save our own life. There's a trauma story that in this culture in the United States that I grew up in, we watched over and over again. It was part of our spiritual practice, the trauma of the cross. There was a great story of trauma. There was a story of a man who overcame his fear of death when the authorities came to seize him. One of his friends pulled out a sword and attacked the men who came to get him, but instead he asked his friend to put his sword away, and then he healed the man who had been injured. He picked up the ear that had been lopped off the man's head and he placed it back on. And then he went with these men without fear of death, apparently. That's how the story goes. Siddhartha Guatama had safety in a kingdom that would be his. Yet when he saw suffering, when he saw death, he chose to move out into the world, to understand suffering, and to overcome suffering. These are the stories that we are told, the stories of enlightenment, the stories of transcending death. Is that not what the true spiritual experience is? I mean, we've made it different. We've made it about wanting to alleviate our symptoms, this spiritual journey that we're on. But it seems to me that we're all still very afraid of death. This is a topic that I approach very carefully because no one really knows how afraid of death they really are or really are not. until faced with death. I think all soldiers who have seen combat can attest to that. We don't really know, right? I became a police officer in my 20s, and we were trained to try to save our own lives. We were shown films of police officers who had died in the line of duty, men who were stuffed into the trunks of vehicles after being overcome and killed on the side of the road. And so we were taught to fear and to protect our own lives. I was in the military, the National Guard. I went to basic training where I received programming. I was given a uniform, and I was put through a number of tests to see if I would be willing to follow orders, to kill or be killed. Yes? This is one way that the authorities help people to overcome their fear of death. Authorities put guns in young men's hands, and they put a uniform on their bodies, and they tell them that they're invested with the authority of the government. The authorities train them, and the authorities send these young men where they please. And the young men walk to their deaths. This is one way the fear of death is overcome. Sometimes the fear of death is overcome outside of the larger scope of authority. Sometimes, like in the model of the Christ, the fear of death is overcome with forgiveness, yes? Non-violently, as in the case of the great soul Mahatma Gandhi, as in the case of Martin Luther King Jr., as in the case of Nelson Mandela. Each of these three stories, examples of men who had overcome their fear of death with forgiveness and nonviolence in their hearts, yes? Other times, the individual overcomes his fear of death without that forgiveness, with anger and violence in his or her heart. We see this as airplanes are flown into buildings. There was a Buddhist monk in Vietnam who overcame his fear of death, and his monastic order went with him to a public place in the street. He was doused with gasoline, and he set himself on fire and sat there, reportedly unflinching at the pain. I guess that he may or may not have been experiencing. I really don't know. Pain is a subjective experience, isn't it? How does that happen? He overcame his fear of death for a cause that was greater than himself. I have another picture in my mind of a man standing in front of a tank at Tiananmen Square. A man who had overcome his fear of death, placing himself in harm's way. I'm from Oklahoma. There was a man named Timothy McVeigh who overcame his fear of death with violence and anger in his heart. Can we take all of this in as our one experience right now without any judgment for any of this? Is that possible? Is it possible to talk about death? Is it possible to talk about those of us who have gone in this direction and that direction? Is it possible for us to talk about death? For us to talk about our brothers who have gone in this direction and that direction without judgment in our hearts? Is it possible to see ourselves in all of these examples right now? Is it possible for us to see this, to examine it? Is it possible for us to take all of this in without judgment? Is it possible to have an authentic spiritual practice while still being ruled by the fear of death? Is it possible to be effective in this world in the name of love while still being controlled by our own fear of death? One of our great teachers who is still alive today, Thich Nhat Hanh, saw many of his brothers and sisters perish in the conflict over there. Yet he remains, and he walks in peace, a great teacher in this world. There are those who will warn us. There are those who will warn us of the great violence that will be done against us as we begin to walk down a path of absolute and unconditional peace. There are those who will remind us that we live in temporary bodies that may be killed. There are those who will remind us that there is violence out there somewhere. There are those who will remind us that if we do not protect ourselves, then we will surely die. There is no argument against that. There is no argument against those cautions. And how can one know how one will respond in the face of a threat that comes against our body. One cannot really know. Have you ever watched that television show, Naked and Afraid? Oftentimes they'll pair this a small woman with a big guy from the South who touts his strength and prowess. And I've noticed in the times that I've watched that show, it is often that man who crumbles emotionally and mentally before the woman that they have placed him with, which is a great insult to that man's ego. I can see myself in that man. I can see myself in that man. But who am I seeing? I'm seeing the ego. I'm seeing that man who creates a false image of himself, right? A false image of strength, which, when put to the test, cannot stand, right? So it is not with a great proclamation of my own transcendence of the fear of death that I make this recording now. No. Because I have seen this man under stress. Yet there's still a lesson here, isn't there? Can we say that we love while we are still afraid of death? And what happens if we choose to sacrifice ourselves? If we don't have love? If we choose to make ourselves a martyr for the sake of being a martyr or for the sake of making a point? Is there a way that love and love alone can set us free from the fear of death? Is that what we see in the examples of Nelson Mandela, Martin Luther King, Mahatma Gandhi? Is that what we are witnessing there in ourselves? If we can release ourselves from the story of the individual for a moment, if we can imagine that as we look at the lives of those three great men, that we are actually seeing ourselves. Can we do that for a moment? Can we look at them as if we are one? Can we give ourselves that gift? Can we see our own nobility? Can we see our own courage? Can we see our own fearlessness? Can we see our own love in those imperfect men? Can we see ourselves in the heart of the man who stood in front of the tank at Tiananmen Square? The man who is nameless to me? Isn't that appropriate sometimes, though? It's just an image. An image of significance. Of a man who is nameless to me. An image of fearlessness. An image of an individual who had transcended his fear of death and in a moment was living for a greater purpose. What's that like? I am engaged in this spiritual practice. I'm engaged in a course. It's called A Course in Miracles. I'm I'm on day 119 of something like that, of a 365-day course of study. And the course, at its core, asks us to see that these bodies are not who we are. It's a metaphysical structure, right? The course is meant to be an offense to the ego. The course on a day-to-day basis is meant to forgive that one who is afraid of death. And the Course doesn't ask you to believe anything necessarily. It just asks you to work the Course. And I'm not asking you to subscribe yourself to that Course right now. I'm just mentioning it as a personal note, kind of why I'm speaking these words right now, because it's helped me to see that as long as I fear the death of this body, that I cannot truly manifest love. So the Course is quite radical, and it asks us to suspend the belief that we are these bodies. And I realize now that is a legitimate path, right? That is a legitimate practice. Yes? The belief in something greater than our individual lives. Is that not what those examples, is that not the state of consciousness that those men had accomplished? The Christ, the Buddha, MLK, Mandela, Gandhi, even Timothy McVeigh, and the Vietnamese monk who set himself on fire, and the man who stood in front of the tank, and even, yes, those foreign terrorists that we fear so greatly. They've all suspended their belief in the importance of their individuality, have they not? Somehow, in one way or another, making no judgment, right? I'm not making any judgments right now. I'm just observing, examining, asking you to engage in this thought experiment also. I am not a man of violence, yet I can see the violence in me, in those violent examples, and I have known the violence in myself. My teachers tell me, Pema Chodron and Thich Nhat Hanh, they tell me that if I see a little bit of violence in myself, it is the same violence that I see in those others that I think I may need to judge for their terrible acts of violence. And I think this is the teaching of the Christ also, that it's not just if I murdered, it's have you ever had murder in your heart, right? So can we identify ourselves with all of these examples? Can we understand ourselves as the one? Can we suspend our own judgment? Can we forgive? Can we forgive ourselves for being afraid of death? And I think this is what we often discover when we go on some kind of sacred medicine journey. Yes? If you're taking that medicine outside of an intent for healing, and you have a hard time with it, you might call it a bad trip, right? But the shamans, or those in the healing practice who are engaged in helping people overcome their fears with the use of these sacred medicines, they might say, you just had a challenging journey. They might say, you got exactly what you needed, right? I remember when I was a young man as a police officer, there was one night when I was dressing for work, putting on my Kevlar vest, strapping my holster and my sidearm around my waist. And I had a strong sense that I wasn't going to come back, that I wasn't going to make it through my night's work. And obviously that wasn't true. But I was a young man wearing a uniform, and I decided to go to work that night. I recently spoke to a combat veteran who described how when he was 19 years old and he was in a combat zone, how he overcame his fear of death as he made out his will and testament, right? And that since then he has feared no one or nothing. What is it to transcend fear? I've heard it said that fear of death is really the only fear there is. What is it like when we no longer believe in the significance of this individual body? What is it like when we tap into a greater purpose, a higher power, a deeper experience, our true self, that one in us that is inviolate, that one that cannot be injured? The first lines in A Course in Miracles is, nothing that is real can be threatened, and nothing that is unreal exists. And I think there is a universal truth there, one that the Christ understood. If we understand that nothing that is real in us can be threatened, then are we not empowered to live a transcended life? If we understand that all of those entities out there that seem to be threatening us are unreal, that suffering and hate and death are all illusions, then who are we if we are no longer driven by our fear of death? I believe these to be important questions for those of us who seem to be on this path of awakening right now. Can we ask a deeper power to rise from within? Can we request the assistance of a Holy Spirit to remind us of who we really are, so that we can be where we need to be when we need to be there? Overcoming our fear of death is impossible as long as we're embodying the shallow natures of our being, the ego, the false self. Our flesh will contract unless we have a deeper practice, unless we are embodied by that deeper presence, by that deeper power, by that deeper love, by the true self, by the Christ, the One. The language is inconsequential once we begin to experience the isness, that suchness, the great I am. Once we are inhabited by the breath of God, the nameless one, the Tao that can be named is not the Tao at all. The knowledge that can be known is not true knowledge. That which we can name is not it, because words are form, and all form is transcended. And these are some of our initial lessons in overcoming our fear, right? Overcoming fear, seeing through the fear, yes? How do we see through the fear? First, we must realize that there is nothing to fear but fear itself, right? Which means that fear is not real. Now, how far do we have to go in our practice to realize that? How do we practice that on a daily basis, reminding ourselves of the non-reality of fear? Well, we might begin to understand that none of this is real, right? Because so much of what we see and seem to experience in this world has no meaning, is meaninglessness. So we begin to see through that meaninglessness as a practice, right? Day by day. And oftentimes that begins when we have holy scriptures and sacred texts which point to a deeper meaning, which help us to see through, right? This is the universal experience. This is the universal practice. This is what happens across the board. There's no universal theology, but there is a universal experience. And this is the universal experience, is that we begin to see through the non-reality, the unrealness of the world that we seem to be seeing. And then as we do that, we can go in two basic directions as we're seeing through the bullshit, right? In one way, we can begin to hate and resent because we live in a disingenuous world. And that happens when we believe in the illusion of separate self, right? When we refuse to look inside of ourselves and see that we are actually living inauthentic lives, right? So that's the path of hate and death. When we refuse to look at ourselves and see ourselves as part of the false world, we make ourselves self-righteous and we elevate ourselves above a false world. And in that, we are becoming false ourselves because we are giving ourselves to hate. But there's another way to go as we see through the world. And this is the way that the Christ showed us. It's that we understand that that world is not real, and we understand that those who seem to be crucifying us, or the world that seems to be crucifying us, is us. We see ourselves, we see the oneness, we understand, we see the big picture, we are elevated. And in that experience, we call forgiveness. We find a new life, a life of love, a life of resurrection. Forgiveness is impossible from the shallow nature of our being. Forgiveness is impossible from the ego, from the false self. But as we find ourselves to be love, we find ourselves to be forgiveness. Forgiveness is beyond the rational mind. Yet it is a rational assent, because it is what sets us free. It is what brings true love and true freedom into this world. Once we realize that we are not victims of this world. And so, with love, with forgiveness in our hearts, we move. With love, with forgiveness in our hearts, we go where we need to go, and we speak to who we need to speak to, and we say what we need to say, with absolute and unconditional forgiveness in our hearts, in the spirit of MLK, in the spirit of Nelson Mandela, in the spirit of the great soul Mahatma Gandhi. Yes, as our teachers have shown us to do. As these beings who continue to seem to be in this world, right? It's not about being a perfect and ascended being, but it is about acknowledging that perfect and ascended being that is within us. Yes? Do you see, my friend? I love you. I bring you this message with peace and love in my heart. I want you to be happy. I wish you well. Namaste. God bless you. We are one.